In March of 2019, in the Fellowship Hall of the First Baptist Church of Blanco, Texas, a county extension agent named Glenn Marsh stood at a laminate podium in front of 43 ranchers and told Ruth Carver, in a voice that was friendly and clear and absolutely certain, and in his professional estimation, hobby farming. It was sentiment dressed up as a plan, and the county had seen enough sentiment. Glenn was not unkind. He was a man with a range science degree from Texas Tech, 22 years in the extension office, a white county logo pickup he kept spotless, and the patient, unhurried manner of someone who has never been wrong about anything that mattered. He told Ruth she was welcome to keep the donkeys. If they brought her joy, he just wanted her to understand they were not a brush management strategy. 3 years and 5 months later, on the 26th of August, 2022, a hydrologist named Ray Aldridge crouched at the mouth of a limestone draw on Ruth's north pasture and measured the spring that ran there. He had a flow meter, a clipboard, and a client in San Antonio who had been asking about water for 2 years. Ray wrote a number on his pad. He read it aloud. The number was 4.2 gallons per minute, Inuit, certified and continuous, in the worst drought year Blanco County had recorded since the 1,950 seconds. Glenn Marsh was standing 20 feet behind Ray when that number was read. He had driven over uninvited. He did not say anything for a long time. The story of the years between those two moments is the story of what a woman with a spiral-bound journal, 18 working donkeys, and a very particular understanding of how water moves through limestone did when the people who knew better told her to quit. Ruth Carver had lived on those 220 acres in the valley west of Blanco since she married Harlan Carver in 1981. Harlan had run the place since his own father handed it to him in 1974, a rectangle of cedar-choked limestone ridges and one good draw on the north end where a spring used to run before the cedar came back thick enough to close it down sometime in the 1,960 seconds. Harlan was known in Blanco County for 2 things, his stillness and his donkeys. He was not a man who raised his voice, and he was not a man who bought anything he did not need. What he bought in 1978 was 2 jennies and a jack from an outfit near Fredericksburg, and from those 3 animals he built his herd over 30 years, selecting for the ones that browsed hardest, moved slowest, and stayed out of trouble. By the time Harlan died of a heart attack in January of 2009, there were 21 donkeys on the place and a spiral-bound journal on the kitchen counter that held 30 years of observations, every spring location on the property, every flow reading Harlan had ever taken. Ruth kept the journal, she kept the donkeys, 18 of them, by then the 3 oldest having died in the years before Harlan did. Neighbors told her the donkeys were a memory of Harlan and not a plan, and Ruth did not disagree with them or argue. She just kept working. She had her own ideas about the North Draw, and she had Harlan's journal, and one entry in particular that she had read many times since 2009. It was dated September of 1983. Harlan had written, in the careful print he always used, "Cleared North Cedar this spring. Took 11 days for water to show at the draw. 2 gallons a minute ran through October." That spring had closed again by 2009 because the cedar had come back. Ruth intended to reopen it. She did not talk about this plan at the stockmen's meeting in March of 2019. She was there because the Extension Office had called a meeting about the drought forecast, which was pointing at a dry spring, and because she wanted to hear what Glenn Marsh thought the county ought to be doing about brush pressure on the recharge zones. Glenn was not focused on recharge zones. He was focused on production, on stocking rates, on the cost per acre, of various clearing methods, which he ranked in order. Aerial herbicide spray was most cost-effective at scale. Dozer crews were appropriate for severe encroachment, and goats were a reasonable supplementary option. Donkeys did not appear on his chart. When Ruth asked from the third row whether the county had looked at how donkey pressure on cedar root zones affected infiltration rates into the limestone, Glenn had smiled at her with the patience of a man who had heard many folk theories and had to answer each one respectfully. He said he was not aware of peer-reviewed research supporting that relationship. He said the county's position was based on the best available range science. He said, with the particular warmth of someone delivering a correction, "That's hobby farming, Ruth. It's sentiment dressed up as a plan." Several people in the room nodded. Wayne Tatum, who ran 410 acres on the east side of the county road, gave a small shrug that meant he agreed with Glenn but was too decent a man to pile on. Ruth folded the printed agenda she'd been holding and set it on the chair beside her. She did not raise her voice. She said, "All right," and Glenn moved on to the next question. Biscuit was waiting at the fence when Ruth got home. Biscuit was the led jenny of the herd, a gray-brown animal with a dark dorsal stripe running from her withers to her tail, a jenny who had been born on the place in 2004 and who understood the routine of the north pasture, the way an old dog understands its yard. She was standing at the wire near the cattle guard when Ruth's truck came up the drive, watching the road with the flat, appraising calm that donkeys have when they have decided something is not worth startling over. Ruth cut the engine and sat for a moment. Then she got out, and Biscuit walked along the fence line to meet her. "Let me tell you about ash juniper, because without that, you will not understand anything that happened on Ruth Carver's 220 acres between 2009 and the 26th of August, 2022. Ash juniper goes by cedar in the hill country, and in Blanco County it has been the central fact of land management for most of the 20th century. It is not native in the density you see now. In the era before fire suppression and overgrazing thinned the native grasses and closed down the periodic burns that kept cedar in check, it grew in patches on the ridgetops and the caliche breaks, not in the continuous dark green carpet it makes today. Once cedar occupies a hillside, it does not share. Its root mat spreads laterally to 20 feet or more from the trunk base, wicking soil moisture and establishing a dense fibrous layer that resists infiltration. What that means in practical terms is this. When rain falls on a cedar-covered slope in the hill country, somewhere between 30 and 40% of it never reaches the soil at all. It hits the flat scale leaves of the cedar canopy, beads, and evaporates before it can soak in. That process has a name in hydrology. It is called interception loss. The remaining rainfall that does reach the soil finds the root mat waiting, and most of that water is taken up by the cedar itself or runs laterally off the hard pan beneath the mat, rather than infiltrating downward into the fractured limestone that recharges the Edwards Aquifer. The Edwards Aquifer feeds the springs of the hill country. It is recharged through specific zones where the limestone is fractured and close to the surface, and the soil above it is not compacted or matted over. Clear those zones of cedar, allow native grasses to establish their deep fibrous roots, allow hoof traffic to break up soil aggregate and restore infiltration pores, and rainfall begins moving downward again into the fractures and from there into the aquifer. Springs that have been closed for decades sometimes reopen within weeks. Harlan Carver had watched this happen in 1983 and written it down. 11 days. What Harlan had understood and what Glenn Marsh's peer-reviewed literature had not measured carefully enough was the difference between killing cedar and clearing it. A herbicide application kills the visible plant. The root mat remains. It decomposes, but slowly, over years. And during that decomposition, it releases tannins that suppress the soil biota responsible for rebuilding aggregate structure. The infiltration zone does not recover quickly after a spray. A dozer removes the cedar, but it also removes the topsoil and scarifies the limestone caprock, which is the very surface through which infiltration occurs. A dozer crew does the worst possible thing to a recharge zone. It clears the cedar and destroys the surface. It was trying to free a donkey, does neither of those things. A donkey browses cedar bark and green shoots, suppressing regrowth without killing the root, which then begins its slow die-off on its own timetable. A donkey's hoof is small and hard, and it strikes the soil at a steep angle, breaking up the surface layer in a way that restores infiltration pores rather than destroying them. A donkey deposits organic matter, dung rich in nitrogen and microbial life, that begins building soil aggregate structure from the first season. And a donkey moves slowly, returning to the same areas repeatedly over months, which is exactly the kind of patient, distributed pressure that breaks the cedar root mat's capillary network without damaging the limestone beneath. Harlan Carver had not known any of this in the scientific vocabulary that Ray Oldridge would later use. He had known it the way a man knows something he has watched for 30 years on one piece of ground. He had written it in a spiral-bound journal in careful print and left it on the counter for Ruth. In the spring of 2019, Ruth moved her 18 donkeys onto the north 40 acres of her property, the ground nearest the old draw where the spring had last run, in the 1,980 seconds. She had fenced a loose rotation through there over the previous winter, low-stress movable panels that kept the herd on a section for 4 to 6 weeks before rotating them to the next. The cedar on the North 40 was thick and dark, 15 to 20 feet tall in places, and the ground beneath it was bare caliche, with almost no grass. Neighbors drove past on the county road and saw a patchy, rough-looking pasture, cedar half-stripped to 8 feet and littered with hoof-churned dirt, donkeys standing in the shade of what remained. It did not look like progress. It looked like the confusion of someone who did not know what they were doing. Wayne Tatum was not confused. Wayne knew exactly what he was doing, and in the spring of 2019 he had the receipts to prove it. He had financed a self-propelled herbicide spray rig the previous fall, $94,000 through the ag lender in town, and in March of 2019, the same week as the stockmen's meeting, he had hired a dozer crew to clear the worst cedar breaks on his east pasture. The dozer crew cost him $18,000 and 4 days of noise that could be heard across the county road. By April, Wayne's east pasture was bare mineral soil and cedar/in windrows, and Wayne walked it with Glenn Marsh one afternoon and pointed at the open sky where the cedar canopy had been and said it was going to be coastal Bermuda by fall. Glenn said he thought that was a reasonable goal. They both walked back to their truck satisfied. Wayne was a good man. He was not a schemer or a braggart. He had 2 grown sons who had gone to San Marcos for college, a wife named Sandra who ran the feed store on the south edge of town, and a genuine affection for his neighbors that included Ruth, toward whom he felt something between admiration and mild concern. He had been at the stockmen's meeting. He had heard Glenn's correction, and he thought Glenn was right, and he thought Ruth was holding on to something that belonged to Harlan and not to the land. He was not wrong to think this. He simply did not have enough information. Wayne had taken on the spray rig loan because the math had penciled out, or appeared to. Cedar encroachment on his east pasture had been reducing his carrying capacity for a decade, and the county aglander had walked him through an analysis showing that clearing 60 acres of that ground would add enough forage to support 30 additional head, which at prevailing prices over 5 years, the analysis was correct as far as it went. It did not account for what the dozer work would do to the soil structure, or what clearing without rebuilding the native grass understory would do to the ground's ability to hold moisture through a dry summer. Wayne ran coastal Bermuda because Glenn had recommended it and because it established fast and grazed well and was exactly what a sensible rancher with cleared hill country ground was supposed to do. By the spring of 2020, his east pasture looked as good as it had looked in 30 years. He had 100 head on 410 acres, a clean outfit, a new bale feeder still in the manufacturer's blue paint, and every reason to believe he had made the right call. He drove past Ruth's north pasture on his way to town twice a week and saw the donkeys moving through the cedar and the rough, disturbed ground and thought what he thought and felt, if anything, a quiet sympathy. He brought Ruth a side of pork from his hogs at Christmas, and they talked for an hour on her porch, and he did not mention the donkeys, and neither did she. They had known each other too long for that. Ruth's granddaughter, Lena, arrived in late May of 2021, at the start of the summer before her senior year at Texas A&M, where she was studying range science. She had driven down from College Station in a 10-year-old Subaru with a sleeping bag and a stack of reading for a thesis she had not yet chosen. She was 23 and quick, and she loved her grandmother in the complicated way that also includes a measure of worry. She had heard about the donkeys from her mother, who had heard about the stockman's meeting, and Lena had done enough coursework to know that Glenn Marsh's position on brush management was the standard one, and was not wrong in the general sense. She walked the North 40 on her second day there and came back to the porch, quieter than she had left. The cedar on the north side was markedly thinner than it had been in photographs she had seen from 2018. The ground showed bare patches of exposed limestone, which was not what you wanted to see on most range sites, but here it was different, because exposed limestone was exposed recharge surface, and the native grasses coming in on the cleared ground were city oats, grama, and little bluestem, plants with root systems that went 2 feet or more into the soil. She did not say anything about this to Ruth. She poured herself a glass of water from the tap and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Harlan's journal, which Ruth had left open to the 1983 entries, and read them for a long time. The journal was not the work of a scientist. It was the work of a man who paid attention. Harlan had recorded rainfall amounts and noted which draws ran and which did not. He had tracked which sections of cedar he cleared in which years, and then noted months later whether the grass had come back, and at what density. He had drawn rough maps in pencil, sections labeled by year and method, some marked donkeys only, some marked hand-cut and donkeys, and across those maps he had penciled in spring locations, rated by flow in rough terms, a few drops, a trickle, a real flow. The 1983 entry was not unusual in form. It was just the most specific. He had cleared the North 40's cedar thicket over 3 months, in the spring of that year starting in February, and in early September the spring had appeared. What struck Lena, sitting at the table with the journal and the 2 years of coursework she had behind her, was the timeline. 11 days was fast. Very fast for a gravity-fed spring drawing from a recharge zone that had been cedar-suppressed for at least a decade. That meant the recharge pathway had not closed. It had been blocked, not destroyed. The cedar had been intercepting rainfall that would otherwise have moved into the limestone, and when the cedar was cleared, the rainfall moved. 11 days to travel from the surface through the fractured limestone and appear at the Draw's limestone ledge was not a slow aquifer response. It was a local perched system, near surface, sensitive to surface cover. Her thesis on range recovery had a hydrology section. She had cited papers on brush control and watershed yield. She had not cited anything on donkeys. She did not say anything to Ruth that evening. She helped with the dinner dishes and went to bed, and lay there for a while, thinking about hydraulic conductivity and the soil cores she had not yet pulled. That was where the first crack appeared, though Lena did not call it that. She just kept reading. It was on a Wednesday in June of 2021 that Wayne Tatum said, the second time. Ruth had driven over to return a post-hole digger she had borrowed, and Wayne was walking his east pasture, which had its coastal Bermuda established, and looked exactly as clean and uniform and productive as he had hoped. He was in good spirits. He had restocked in the fall at 110 head on his newly cleared acreage, and the grass was holding. He stood at his fence line and looked across the county road at Ruth's north pasture, where the donkeys were working a new section and the ground still showed that rough, half-stripped, hoof-churned look that meant the clearing was active. Wayne shook his head in the mild way that meant he was not judging, but was also not convinced. "No offense," he said, "but what you're doing over there, Ruth, it's hobby farming." He handed the post-hole digger back to her over the fence. "I hope it makes you happy." Ruth took the digger and said, "I appreciate you lending it." She drove home. She checked the flow in the draw that evening, crouching at the rocky lip of the limestone ledge, where the spring had last run in Harlan's time. There was moisture in the rock crevices. Not flow moisture. Wes. She noted it in the journal with the date. By the fall of 2021, the tension between what Wayne's pasture looked like and what Ruth's pasture looked like was at its peak. Wayne's east pasture was a clean, uniform stand of coastal Bermuda, closely grazed, well managed by any conventional standard. Ruth's North 40 had a ragged look, a mix of cedar stumps at browse height, clumps of native grass at irregular intervals, exposed caliche, and 18 donkeys working through it in their slow, deliberate way. Glenn Marsh drove past one afternoon in October and slowed without stopping. He had his reasons for that, and they were not uncharitable ones. He simply saw what he expected to see. What he did not see was what was happening in the fractured limestone 4 feet beneath the surface of Ruth's north draw. He could not have seen it. There was no instrument for it at that moment. What was happening was this. 4 seasons of donkey pressure on the cedar root zone had broken the capillary network in the mat sufficiently that rainwater was now moving downward through the soil, aggregate rather than sheeting off it. The native grasses, sidewatts, grama, and little bluestem, had sent their root systems into the cleared soil and were holding the topsoil against runoff, while simultaneously creating the slow, fibrous pathway that fed water downward rather than across. The spring in the north draw had been moving toward activation for 2 years. No one could see it from the road. Lena had started spending evenings at the kitchen table with Harlan's journal. She did not say much, but her questions had changed. They were no longer questions about whether Ruth's approach was sound. They were questions about mechanism. How deep did the grama roots go in this soil type? What was the hydraulic conductivity of the caliche zone on the north 40? Whether Harlan had noted anything about infiltration times during the 1983 event, Ruth answered what she could and pointed Lena to the pages she could not. The drought declared itself in June of 2022, though the signs had been arriving since March. Blanco County had received 6.1 inches of rain between January and May of that year, against a normal of 14.4. The hill country had had dry stretches before, but the combination of low rainfall, high June temperatures, and a soil moisture deficit going back to the previous fall put 2022 into a different category. By the third week of June, the National Drought Monitor had placed Blanco County in D4, exceptional drought, the highest category on the scale. Stock tanks began going dry by mid-July. The county road water troughs that the Conservation District maintained were being refilled twice a week instead of once feed store prices climbed. Wayne Tatum's 110 head on the east pasture were eating through his coastal Bermuda faster than it could recover in the heat. And by the end of July, he was supplementing with hay at a cost that was reshaping his summer budget. The coastal Bermuda was the problem, though Wayne did not see it that way in July. It was a productive grass in normal years, highly palatable, fast-growing in warm, wet conditions. In a drought, it behaved the way any shallow-rooted monoculture behaves. It stopped. The roots of coastal Bermuda in hill country soils ran 8 to 14 inches on a good day. In the baked caliche of a D4 drought July, there was no moisture within 14 inches of the surface, and the grass shut down, turned brown at the tips, and stopped providing the cover that moderated soil temperature. Subron, the bare mineral soil between plants, heated to temperatures that killed the surface, biota, and formed a crust that shed what little rain did fall, rather than absorbing it. Wayne's east pasture, the ground he had cleared and planted and financed and been proud of, was a 60-acre dust problem in July of 2022. His cattle moved to the fence lines and stood in the shade of the cedar remnants at the pasture edges, because the cedar at least kept the sun off the ground underneath it, and the ground there was several degrees cooler than the open pasture floor. The irony of that was not lost on Wayne. He did not mention it to anyone. It was at the feed store in late July that Hal Pemberton, who ran 180 acres on the south side of the county road, said it the third time. He had been talking to someone about the wells situation, about who was already having to haul. And he mentioned Ruth's north pasture, in the way you mention something when you're frustrated and looking for a fixed point. Glenn always said it was hobby farming, Hal said. Looks like he was right. She could have put that ground to work, and she's got donkeys. He was not a mean man. He was a tired man in a dry July. He did not know that 6 days later, at the north end of Ruth's property, the spring would begin to run. Ruth found the water on a Thursday morning, the 4th of August. She had walked the draw at dawn, as she had been doing every few days since June, and at the limestone ledge, where Harlan had measured in 1983, there was a thread of water moving along the rock face. Not a seep. Flow. She stood there for a long time. Biscuit had followed her down the slope, as she often did, and was standing at the edge of the limestone shelf, where the ground was still dark with moisture, ears forward, perfectly still. The water ran over a small lip of rock and disappeared into the gravel at the base of the draw. Ruth put her hand in it. She came back at noon, and it was still running. She came back at dusk, still running. Down the county road, Wayne Tatum's well had gone dry on the 2nd of August. He had a 280-foot cased well that had never failed in the 23 years he had been running the place, and on a Monday morning it pulled mud and then air and then nothing. He called the well driller and was told the earliest available crew was 3 weeks out. He began hauling water from town in a 500-gallon tank on a flatbed, 2 runs a day to keep his cattle going. By mid-August, with hay costs mounting and hauling costs stacking on top, he made the decision he had been avoiding for 2 weeks. He sold 140 head of his cattle, the better part of his herd, at the sale barn in Fredericksburg. The market was distressed. He took $62 per hour undread weight, against the $98 he would have expected in a normal August. Wayne drove home from the sale barn and sat in his truck in the driveway for a while before he went inside. Ruth's spring ran through August, gaining volume. She had been measuring it with a catch bucket and a watch. The old method, the one Harlan had used. By the 20th of August, she was clocking it at just over 4 gallons per minute. She checked it against Harlan's best recorded reading, 2 gallons per minute in October of 1983. The spring was running stronger now than it had in living memory. She called Ray Aldridge on the 22nd. Ray was a water rights attorney and licensed hydrologist out of San Antonio, a compact man in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the habit of going quiet before he said anything important. He had a client who had been looking for a reliable water source in the hill country for 2 years, a development interest. With the money to acquire an easement, Ray had measured springs all over the Edwards Plateau. He had seen plenty of them, and he had also seen plenty of people who thought they had a spring and had a seep. He drove up on the morning of the 26th of August in a white truck that was not county logo white, but personal truck white, and he pulled out a portable flow meter and a clipboard and did not say much for the first 40 minutes. Ruth stood up the slope and let him work. Lena stood beside her. Lena had been out there every morning since the 4th, measuring, noting, talking less, and observing more, and she had stopped asking questions about whether the method was sound. She had seen the answer. Glenn Marsh arrived partway through Ray's measurement. He had heard, through the county grapevine, that someone was out measuring water on the Carver place, and he came uninvited, which said something about where his own certainty had been sitting since July, since the wells started failing. He parked on the road and walked in without announcing himself and stood back far enough to make clear he was not interfering. Ray crouched at the limestone ledge for a long time. He was methodical. He placed the flow meter's sensor in the channel where the water moved fastest, waited for the reading to stabilize, noted it, then moved the sensor 12 inches to test for variance. He checked the temperature of the water with a second gauge, because spring temperature tells a hydrologist something about residence time, the length of time water has spent underground before emerging. This spring was running at 63 degrees, cool and steady, which meant it was drawing from a zone deep enough and insulated enough to maintain a constant temperature despite August air that stood at 96. He wrote that down. He recalibrated the flow meter and ran it again from the beginning. He did not hurry. Ruth did not move from where she was standing. She had learned years ago watching Harlan that the moment you started managing someone else's process was the moment you stopped learning anything from it. Ray knew what he was doing. She watched Lena watching Ray and saw in Lena's face the particular attention of a person whose existing framework is being quietly strained. Glenn Marsh stood 20 feet back from the ledge, his hands in his pockets, his weight on one hip, in the posture of a man who has told himself he is only here to observe. Ray straightened up. He looked at his gauge for a moment before he spoke, and in that moment the draw was very quiet. The water moved over the rock lip and down into the gravel. It made a sound that was entirely ordinary, and in the context of that August was nothing less than astonishing. He looked up the slope at Ruth and read the number aloud. 4.2 gallons per minute. The draw was quiet. A cedar wren called from somewhere up the ridge and stopped. Ray made the notation on his clipboard. He did not speak again for nearly a minute, and neither did anyone else. Ruth looked at the number on the gauge and then looked at the water running over the rock lip, the same thin, clear thread that had been there on the 4th and had grown into something you could hear now, a steady sound in the dry air of a drought August. 4.2 gallons per minute. Inute. On the worst water day Blanco County had seen in 70 years. Glenn Marsh looked at the spring. He looked at the donkeys on the adjacent hillside. He looked back at the spring. A man whose model had never failed in front of him was watching it fail in front of him, quietly, without drama, in the presence of flowing water and summer heat, and a measurement he could not dispute. Ray said he had been authorized to offer $180,000 for a 20-year water easement on the spring, contingent on the flow sustaining at this rate through September. Ruth said she appreciated it and was going to decline. Ray nodded as though he had expected this. He said the offer stood through the end of the year. If she changed her mind, he packed his flow meter and walked back up to his truck. Glenn Marsh had not moved from where he was standing. He waited until Ray's truck was gone. "Wes'n?" He looked at the water in the draw for a long time, and then he looked at the donkeys on the adjacent hillside, 7 of them visible from where he stood, moving slow and deliberate through the half-cleared cedar. He looked at the native grasses coming in along the draw, sidewatts, grama thick and fibrous, holding the soil above the fractured limestone. He was not a stupid man. He was a man whose model had just been amended by a fact he could not dispute. He said, "I'd like to bring a team out here, Texas A and M Extension, Water Resources. I'd like them to see this." He said it plainly, the way a man says something when he means it, and does not want to qualify it. "I want to understand what happened here." Lena said, without looking at Glenn, "I can walk you through the journal. The rest of that fall, and through the winter that followed, things moved at the pace that things move in the hill country, which is to say they moved slowly and in the right direction. Glenn Marsh brought his Texas A&M team in September. They spent 2 days on the North 40, measuring infiltration rates, pulling soil cores, mapping the spring's recharge zone across Ruth's cleared acreage. The lead researcher, a woman from the university's Water Resources program, said she had not seen a recharge zone recovery of this kind documented in the hill country in the peer-reviewed literature, and asked Ruth if she would be willing to let them write it up. Ruth said she would want to read it first. The research team confirmed what Ruth and Harlan's journal had suggested. The cleared zone on the North 40 showed infiltration rates 3 to 4 times higher than the uncleared cedar ground on the adjacent slope, and the biological activity in the soil, the microbial count and aggregate structure was measurably stronger in areas of highest donkey use. The spring's recharge zone, as mapped by the team's ground-penetrating instruments, corresponded almost exactly to the rotation pattern Ruth had been running the donkeys through since 2019. The dismissive label had 3 voices. The corrective had one. The water moving at 4.2 gallons per minute inute in August in the drought year because a woman had put donkeys on cedar-covered limestone for 3 years and let them do what her husband had watched them do 40 years before. Wayne Tatum restocked in October. After the sale barn, prices recovered. He came over to Ruth's place in November, a cool afternoon with the cedar smell sharp in the air, and they sat on the porch, and he asked her to explain the rotation schedule. He was not a man who found this easy. He did not have to make it easy. Ruth poured coffee and showed him the pasture maps Harlan had drawn in the late 1982, updated in her own handwriting, and explained the panel rotation and how long you left a section before moving the herd. Wayne said he did not have donkeys. Ruth said she could spare 3 from her herd if he wanted to start with the draw on his east side, the one that Harlan's journal noted as a historic spring site, going back to at least the 1942. Wayne said he would think about it. By the following spring, he had called back and said yes. 3 donkeys on loan. With a grazing agreement, Ruth wrote out by hand on a piece of paper that Lena typed up and both parties signed. 3 more neighbors came through the following summer, after the A&M paper circulated through the extension network. Ruth leased donkeys to 4 operations in total, drew up rotation maps for each, and charged enough to cover her costs and the small return that she kept in an account she did not touch. She was not trying to build a business. She was trying to keep the knowledge useful. Lena finished her senior thesis in the spring of 2023 and submitted it to the Texas Extension Journal, where it was published the following September under both her name and the A&M Water Resources team. The title of the paper was not the same as the story. The paper was about hydraulic conductivity and infiltration rates and the comparative recovery of recharge zones under different clearing regimes. The story, which the paper did not tell because papers do not tell stories, was about a spiral-bound journal left on a counter, and a lead Jenny named Biscuit, and a woman who did not raise her voice at the stockman's meeting and went home and kept working. The journal is on Lena's shelf now in the apartment she rented in Austin when she took a position with the Hill Country Alliance, a nonprofit focused on aquifer health and groundwater conservation. Ruth said she could have it when she left for Austin in the fall of 2023, and Lena took it without making a ceremony of it, just tucked it into a canvas bag, along with her other things. She had read every entry by then. She had underlined, in pencil, the September 1983 entry about the North Cedar, 11 days, 2 gallons a minute. The spring still runs on Ruth's north pasture. It ran through the winter of 2022 and through the wet spring of 2023 and through the dry summer of 2024. Ruth measured it once a month, as Harlan had done, and recorded it in a new notebook she bought at the hardware store in Blanco. The donkeys are still on the North 40 and working east now, into a cedar-covered section that Harlan had flagged in 1991 as a likely second spring site, one that had been closed since the 1952. Ruth does not know when or whether that spring will come back. She knows what the ground needs, and she is giving it what it needs. The morning after Ray Aldridge's visit, she had walked down to the draw before breakfast, the light still flat and cool, and found Biscuit there at the spring's mouth, standing on the wet rock with her hooves in the shallow water, ears forward, looking at nothing in particular. The water ran over her feet and out through the gravel into the draw. It was a small sound in a quiet country. There are 2 things that get called knowledge, and they are not the same thing. One of them lives in databases and peer-reviewed journals and county extension projections and the clean white pickups of people who have been educated to understand the general case. That knowledge is real, and it is often right, and the people who carry it are most of them trying to help. The other kind lives in spiral-bound notebooks kept for 30 years in the habits of an animal selected across a generation for what it does to one particular kind of ground, in the understanding that comes from watching the same draw in the same county through 40 wet years and dry years and drought years and until you know what it is asking for. That knowledge does not travel well. It does not abstract. It does not scale. What it does in the year when every conventional well in the county is pulling air is run at 4.2 gallons per minute in ute in a limestone draw in August, clear and continuous, out of ground that a man in a county logo pickup called hobby farming 3 years before. What a system cannot measure, it will often dismiss. What belongs to a particular piece of ground, tended by the people who learned it there, tends to outlast the dismissal. Biscuit was still at the spring when Ruth walked back up the hill for breakfast. The water ran over her hooves, and she did not move. She had found what the ground was offering, and she was standing in it. That was what she had always done.